All right, so my name's Sherry and I'm in the education section of the North Dakota Game and Fish Department. And a couple of years ago, I was asked to speak on Wildlife of North Dakota face to face. And I know we have all done a lot of regrouping and I have too. Um, when I was originally asked, I was going to present the trunk. We have a Wildlife of North Dakota trunk, and it is full of furs and feathers, skulls. There's wings. We've got all kinds of wildlife artifacts. And it was going to be very interactive. As you can see, I do get to visit classrooms, and the kids just love this. I've done it for adult groups as well. And they're also interested because as adults, you may say, well, I know what that is, but to actually touch it and um, look at the fur and the feet and all the different things that makes that animal unique is really a step above. The trunk also comes with a curriculum. So if teachers want to take it a step further as far as, actually delve into different components of wildlife and wildlife adaptations, then they sure can with that curriculum. Now, having said that, I know that a lot of people, while they think it's interesting, it's probably outside of their comfort zone. And so there are a number of us within the department that can come and speak to your organization in your classroom, wherever, and bring some unique knowledge and are more comfortable with the topic than say someone who's not. If you do check it out, everything is supposed to be labeled. And I say supposed to be because our trunks do get a lot of use. And so just double check to make sure you know what everything is before you bring it out and try to be the expert. So in addition to the trunk, we have something called the Habitats of North Dakota curriculum. And I'll be talking more about that tomorrow. There are 5 different habitats that we have curriculum for: the wetlands, prairie, badlands, riparian, and woodlands. And I've got some images right on the side of the slide there. And so as we go through this, you'll see, say, the image of the wetland, and that will tell you that that habitat, the animal can be found in that habitat. And so if I don't mention it, you should be able to make that link. These curriculum guides are available through the department at no charge. So if that's something you want with your school, library, organization, please let me know and I can send them out to you at no charge. So we're just going to take a survey and kind of walk through and see what kind of critters and critter parts that we have in the trunk. The trunk it's not a giant trunk, I should say. It's actually a duffel bag. And so it's easily moved from location to location. The first group of wildlife species that we're going to talk about we're going to call them ungulates. And ungulates are animals that are kind of like deer, but they're not all deer. So that's why we're calling them ungulates. They have long legs for running on the grass, and their legs have even become longer because they have what's called digigrade locomotion, where they actually walk on their toes instead of flat on their feet like you and I. They have a digestive system to consume grass. Grass is very fibrous, and so if you eat it, it's hard to digest. Ungulates have more than one stomach, in some cases up to 4 stomachs, to actually digest that grass, so they get the maximum nutritional value out of that. And one of the other adaptations that ungulates have is hollow fur. So if you were to look at fur from, say, a deer and pluck a strand of their fur or hair and then slice it in two, you would notice that it's hollow like a straw. And the reason for that is it traps heat and helps to insulate them, because we all know that the prairies are very cold in the winter, and it also helps to keep them cool in the summertime. At the bottom of the screen, you can just see some of the artifacts that we have. We have different samples of fur. And on the back side of the fur, it's very leather-like, and we've written out what species of animal that comes from. We also have different feet, and you can see there we've got an elk foot, and this very small foot is actually a white-tailed deer. And then we've got a couple different kinds of antlers, and then a horn from a pronghorn. Some people call them antelope. So just some ideas of what you can expect to see. So let's talk about the pronghorn first. I'm going to show pictures of the actual animals. So because we don't have actual animals in the trunk, we just have pieces of them. Pronghorn are the fastest land mammal in North America. And you can't outrun them. Even as very young animals, right after they're born, they get up on their feet and they can outrun just about anything. They have horns instead of antlers. Deer have antlers, which means that the bony antler drops every year, whereas the pronghorn, they never lose their horns. But they are very deer-like. And so you might look at them and say, well, they're a lot like a deer. Why can't we call them a deer? Well, if we look at them biologically, their closest living relative in North America is a jackrabbit. So very different from a deer if you want to look at them that way. I should mention, if anybody has any questions along the way, please feel free to ask. This is meant to be interactive, and so I will always entertain questions of those who have that. So 2 of the 4 deer species that we have in North Dakota, the white-tailed deer and the mule deer. The white-tailed deer, in fact, all deer, we should say, the males have antlers, and which means they grow in the spring and they drop them late winter. And so they're very evident during mating season in the fall, and mating season is called rut. The primary habitat of the white-tailed deer is the woodland. However, as you'll find out tomorrow, the woodlands occupy about 2% of the state. So whitetail have really found their way to all habitats in North Dakota. The one claim to fame that white-tailed deer seem to have is their flag-like tail to signal alarm. So if you startle a white-tailed deer, they'll run away, but they'll lift that tail, and that warns any of the other deer in the herd. And so that's a real giveaway as far as what type of deer you're looking at if you're uncertain. Mule deer, found mostly in western North Dakota. They have big ears like mule. They have kind of a small tail with a black tip on the end of it, and they tend to bound instead of run. When my son was little, we would go out and look at the deer. He'd go, I know how to tell mule deer, Mom. They go boing, boing, stop. And so it's true. That's how they run. The picture of mule deer at the bottom there, you can see that their antlers are still growing. There's a substance called velvet, which surrounds the antlers while it's growing. You can kind of see that the antlers look a little fuzzy. When the antlers stop growing, the velvet dries up, and then they kind of scratch off that velvet on trees and brush in the area where they live. The other 2 deer species in North Dakota are moose and elk. And so moose are the largest deer in North Dakota. We find them mostly in woodland areas along the Turtle Mountains and northern tier of the Pembina Valley area. However, moose don't have any natural predators in North Dakota, except for man and hunters, and we have a limited number of hunters because we limit the tags. So their population is doing really well. And so they have wandered onto the prairie, onto farmlands. We've seen them wander into town. And so while we say that their primary area is the woodland area, that's where they originally were, they have wandered throughout almost all of North Dakota. And so it's not uncommon to see them. Elk is the 2nd largest deer in North Dakota. They were once very common in western North Dakota, but only a few remained in the early 1900s. The reason their population dwindled was because of hunters. And so back in 1985, the National Park Service introduced elk into Teddy Roosevelt National Park. Since 1985, the population has grown. And so a lot of western North Dakota, you'll see elk, and they'll even wander a few a little further east as well. We do have hunting seasons on both elk and moose. If you were to draw a tag on an elk or a moose, it's a once in a lifetime tag. And so that's your only chance, at least in North Dakota, to harvest a moose or an elk. Bighorn sheep.
Sherry,
Yeah.
Sherry, I'm not a hunter, so I'm just curious. When you say it's a one-time tag, even if you're unsuccessful, it's a one and done. Is that correct?
That is correct. It's, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, I had an elk tag a few years back, and I spent a lot of time in the Badlands in the summer looking for elk, and then it was kind of a long hunt to actually find one to harvest, but I was successful. But yeah, if you're going to put in for that, I recommend you be committed and you set aside a good amount of time to do so.
Gotcha. Thanks.
Yeah. Bighorn sheep, they're really interesting critters. Our bighorn sheep that were native to North Dakota were extirpated in the early 1900s by hunters, just like the elk were. Extirpated just means that our population was diminished, but they're not extinct elsewhere. They just in North Dakota. The current sheep population that we have in the state was actually brought over from Montana. And so we do trades with different animals with different wildlife agencies. And one of the trades we did was with the bighorn sheep. What they do is they bring them in and they put them in areas where they will be successful as far as living out their life. And bighorn sheep like very remote areas that are not impacted by humans, including roads or, you know, anything like that. Domestic livestock are really tough on them because they're very susceptible to domestic livestock disease. Well, domestic livestock are inoculated, or bighorn or not. So disease makes the leap real quick and wipes out a herd. The cool thing about bighorn sheep is both males and females have horns. The bighorns, of course, the males have larger horns, but they both have horns. The population we have now, and there was an article in the Bismarck Tribune just this morning, we have the highest population we've had in a lot of years in the state, and they're doing very well. And so we're glad to see that. And they are found in the northern Badlands. So north of I-94, all the way up to Watford City area, you can see bighorn if you keep your eyes open. So.
And what is that growth attributed to?
You know, I think what happened was originally when they started trying to put bighorns back in the state, and this is not our first attempt, they got sheep from different parts of the country that were not as well adapted to North Dakota. They put them in areas that were impacted by man through livestock or industry. And so all of those things took a toll. And the last sheep population they got from Montana, they're big sheep, they're hardy, they're used to cold weather. And they put them deep into the Badlands near the North Unit, where there are less roads. And so they're just doing really well.
Sherry, have you heard of anything happening to the wildlife with the recent fires in the Badlands?
You know, whenever there's a fire, there is usually loss of life. However, because these fires have not been really fast moving, I have not heard of them picking up any carcasses of bighorn or elk or anything at this point. The firefighters have done a great job of managing the fires given the conditions that they've had to face. I think the biggest concern was keeping the buffalo away from the firefighters in the North Unit.
Thanks, Sherry.
Sherry, I have a question.
Yeah.
How's the issue with chronic waste disease out west? And has it creeped all the way to the east yet?
No, it has not. We are still in the western part of the state and down by Grant County. And they go county by county. And whenever they find CWD in a county and a hunting unit, then that county is quarantined. So if you were to hunt in, say, Williams County, which is a CWD county, you can still hunt. You can still harvest your animals. We ask that you only take the meat, that you leave the head and all the bones and everything in that county. And we ask that you drop off the head. We have collection places, and we will test that animal. There's a form you have to fill out and attach it to the head, but we'll test that animal for you and let you know if your animal was diseased or not.
And is it recommended you get rid of the meat after if it comes up positive?
You know, the current research says that the disease does not make the leap. However, I don't know if I would eat it. I think I would destroy it. Yeah. It's just not worth it. Other questions? Okay. Bighorn sheep is another one of those once in a lifetime hunting tags. We have limited number of sheep, and so not everybody can get one. And if you get one, it's a one-shot deal again. So let's look at cats and dogs in the state. Cats and dogs are classified as carnivores, which means they only eat meat. And they're found throughout North Dakota in all kinds of different habitats. That picture of me is at a kindergarten class, and I'm holding up a mountain lion skin. So the first cat that we're going to look at is Bobcat. Bobcats are found in western North Dakota. They tend to hunt by pouncing or ambush. If you've ever played with a house cat, they kind of do the same thing, have the same types of behavior. Bobcats are nocturnal and they're fairly secretive. So if you've ever seen one in the wild, it's really kind of a big deal. A lot of times you'll see tracks, but rarely see the cat. And so you can see the fur artifact that I have there. You can see how they would blend in really well with the coloration of the Badlands. So even if they're out there, they're very difficult to see. Other cats that we have in the state, cougar or mountain lion, are found in western North Dakota. 20 years ago, we hardly had any mountain lions in the state at all. What happened was South Dakota's population exploded, and so they had to go somewhere. So they came north, and they found a great home in the Badlands. It's perfect for ambush hunting and hiding, and so there was a population that was established here. And as that population grew, we see males have territories of up to 100 square miles, whereas the females have territories of 25 to 50 square miles. And so as they have litters of kittens and the kittens grow up, the kittens are dispersed. A lot of times the females will stay close, but the young males are kicked out of the territory, and so they have to find a new place to make a home. And so if you've heard of reports of mountain lions in places where they shouldn't be, that's what's happening. Those young males are dispersing. A few years back, we had one that ended up near the ball diamonds in Bismarck. And sadly, that animal had been caught in a small town in western North Dakota, and they let him go. And then he made his way to Bismarck, and he was just trying to rest up. Poor guy didn't know which way was which, but because they are large predators and they cause harm or can cause harm to people and pets, they're not tolerated within city limits. And so the decision was made to destroy the animal. The other type of cat that we have in North Dakota is the lynx. It's found in the Turtle Mountains. They're pretty rare. I've seen one ever. And I lived up in the Turtle Mountains for about 3 years. They're very much like the bobcat, just a little bit bigger. They've got those cool tufts on the ears, and they have really big paws that are made special for making a living in the snow. They act like snowshoes, keep them on top. The dogs that I'm going to talk about, we have coyotes. I don't know if everybody's heard a coyote howl or not. It's a beautiful, eerie call. The young coyotes have a higher pitch, and the older coyotes have a deeper pitch, and they talk to each other just like we talk to each other using words, only they use barks and different sounds. Even though the coyote's classified as a carnivore, in the fall they take advantage of what nature has provided, and they eat a lot of berries and grass and even leaves off of trees. And so, they are well adapted to living in the prairie. And they are denning in the spring. And so right about now, they're getting ready to whelp their puppies, and they'll emerge Here in another month and you'll see small coyotes running around the prairie. They are brown and gray in color, and a big coyote's maybe 35 pounds. So they're not huge animals, but sometimes they seem bigger because their fur is nice and fluffy. The other dog that we're going to talk about is the red fox. They're called a red fox because they're red, but they do vary in color from this beautiful red picture that I have here all the way to almost strawberry blonde, very light. They've got that big poofy tail with the white tip on the end and then a white chest, and they've got some black ear tips as well and black on their legs. They eat berries in the fall, just like the coyote. They den in the spring, just like the coyote. They're found on the prairie, but they're smaller than the coyote. A big fox is 20 pounds. The average is about 15. And so if you put a coyote and a fox side by side, you're going to have some conflicts, and the larger animal's going to win. So the fox will go find other ground to live in just to avoid conflicts and be more successful. Because if the coyotes find them, they will kill them and eat them. So let's talk about rodents. When everybody thinks about rodents, at least in my experience, they think about mice. And we have so many different rodents in our state, and they're not all mice. And so if you look at the picture of the skulls up front, these are from the trunk as well. That first one up front is a beaver skull. Beavers are a rodent. And so all rodents have the same kind of teeth. So look at those big front teeth. They've got an orange stain on them, and all rodents have a stain on their teeth. It's actually a protective coating because rodents' front teeth never stop growing. And so if we were to pull out those front teeth, we could see that they go halfway back into their skull. So the portion up front is maybe a third of the total length of the teeth. So as those grow, they get worn down. And so that's why they're always chewing on things. We know the beavers cut down trees with their teeth. If you happen to have a pet gerbil or hamster, they have to have things to chew on. Same thing comes into play. Looking at the molars on the rodent skull or the beaver skull, we see that they're nice and flat. All rodents are herbivores, which means they only eat plants. And when we talked about herbivores and plant eaters with the deer, we know that that material is difficult to digest. So they have to have those strong grinding teeth. The skull in the middle is a bobcat skull. And looking at the teeth, even if you didn't know what kind of skull it is, you could look at those teeth and you could say, wow, those teeth are sharp. This animal eats other animals. It eats meat, and that's obvious by those teeth. And then the last skull on the back has that long snout. That's actually a coyote skull. And so coyotes, once again, they're classified as carnivores. So you've got those sharp teeth up front and on the side. But in the very back of their mouth, on their jaw, they have some flat molars very similar to the rodents. So all the rodents in North Dakota, we have a number of them. And you can find a rodent in any habitat in the state. So let's talk about beaver and muskrat. I put these guys together because they both live in aquatic environments. For the most part, muskrat, that's the guy with the skinny tail. They live in wetlands, and so they like pond areas. And the beaver, he's on the left, and he's got the big tail. They like areas where there's streams and rivers with water flowing, even though they build up dams to make a pond. But they both build lodges from vegetation. Our muskrat likes to build lodges out of cattails, which is an aquatic plant. Beavers, their preference is to build lodges and dams out of trees and shrubs. However, I was in the Badlands on Williams Lake, and it's in the middle of nowhere. But there was a huge beaver lodge there, and it was made out of cattails for the most part, and just a few pieces of shrub that they could round up. So very adaptable animals. They make do with what nature provides them. Both animals have web feet for swimming. They spend most of their time in the water. They're really not very well adapted to land use because their legs are so short. They like to live in family groups. So they have those big lodges or huts, and they have a whole family of beaver and muskrat living in there together. One of the cool things that both of these animals have that allows them to live where they live, they have thick fur. And if you ever get a chance to touch a fur from a muskrat or a beaver, if you rub it against the grain, it's got some really long, they're called guard hairs, and they're really shiny, and that's what gives the fur its sheen. But then there's also an under fur, which helps to insulate them so that they can go underwater in the winter when there's ice on top, and it keeps them warm. They also have a nice thick fat layer. Not great for us, but really helps the beaver and the muskrat in the wintertime stay alive. If they run out of food in their food storage area, they can absorb that fat and they will be able to make the winter. Beaver and muskrat were almost wiped out by our fur trappers. People trap them today, but the thing about fur trappers, once they run out of animals to trap, they move on to the next area. And the beaver especially was able to rebound, and both species are doing well in North Dakota now. Porcupine. Anybody who has a dog has a porcupine story. They're a rodent. They live in trees and shrubs, and they eat the bark and the leaves. They are really slow moving, and they're really not a threat to anybody unless there's an animal that wants to eat them. And so that's where everybody gets into trouble. They're known for their quills, and you see there's a small jar of porcupine quills. And a porcupine quill is just a modified hair shaft. It's just a different type of hair. So when porcupines are born, they're called porcupets. And when they're born, all the quills are soft. And then once they're exposed to air, then those quills harden. And so if you were to come upon a porcupine, and while we know that they like to live in trees, you do see them traveling across the prairie in search of the next bush or tree. If you were to come up to that animal, threaten it, startle it, first thing it'll do, its hairs will stand on end, like a cat almost. And so because the hair is standing on edge, the porcupine quills will stand up straight. And then that animal will turn its back on you, and it's got this kind of stumpy tail, and it'll switch its tail towards you so to discourage you from coming closer. Now, if it's a coyote or somebody's dog, sometimes they'll go up and they'll try to bite it, and that's when they get the mouthful of porcupine quills. And quills have a unique feature in that on the end they have kind of a fish hook, and it keeps the porcupine stuck into that animal. And usually dogs that have one experience with a porcupine quill or a predator, they don't repeat that experience. I get a lot of questions. Do they fling their quills or do they shoot their quills, especially when I visit some elementary classrooms? And I have to say, no, they do not. They're not superheroes because it's a hair shaft. It just gets loose and it falls out. So that's how those quills get removed. Weasels are kind of fun. They're carnivores for the most part. They're found statewide in all habitats. They're also predators. They can be scavengers as well. They're very smart. If you've ever been to a pet store and you've seen ferrets for sale, they are also a weasel, and people train them to use litter boxes and do all kinds of things. The one great claim to fame with weasels, they all have scent glands. And so they make themselves known wherever they go. Weasels also have kind of long cylinder bodies too. So they're all kind of shaped the same and have short legs. So let's look at the rock star of the weasel family, the skunk. Everybody knows what a skunk is. They're very identifiable with that black shiny fur and the white stripe down the back. They're scavengers. They eat a lot of eggs and insects and small critters. And they're Their smell is known. That's all the deterrent a predator really needs to leave a skunk alone. And even if you've never had a face-to-face encounter with a skunk, my bet is everybody listening has driven down the highway and smelled a skunk that has been hit by a car, because they do release that odor when they die. A fun fact about skunks is that back when everybody wore fur coats, there were lots of fur coats. Skunks were also trapped and used in fur coats. And they do have a very thick, luxurious, long fur. And so they would use them in coats just like they would with mink or beaver or other furs, but they would dye them. And so, because, I mean, who wants to wear a fur coat, right? That's made of a skunk. So they would dye them, and they're called Persian minks because they have the longer fur. And so if you're ever at an auction sale and somebody mentions a Persian mink, you can have it on pretty good authority that that is a skunk. Badger are my favorite animals on the prairie. They are fierce. They're very territorial. They have long claws for digging. They eat a lot of insects, and they dig out rodents. They live in small family groups, and they will stand their ground. If you've got a dog, they'll chase the dog away. Doesn't matter how big or small the dog is. I actually have been chased by a badger. I was trying to get a picture of a mama badger, and she had a couple of babies, and they were very cute. And I got too close, and she chased me all the way back to the truck. So, and even though they have short, stubby little legs, are about 4 inches long, they can run surprisingly fast. So I'm glad I was younger when that happened. Mink are another weasel. They are known for eating muskrat. They tend to live around wetland areas and other aquatic areas, so riparian areas as well. They have thick, luxurious fur that were harvested for mink coats. And the really expensive mink coats, all they did was take that center stripe off the back of the mink. So think about how many mink it would take to make one mink coat. I've never done the math, but it's a lot. Another cool weasel is the short-tailed weasel. I think they're very interesting because they're small rodents. They're only about 10 inches long, so really tiny, but they're still predators. So they just eat rodents that are smaller than them, but they change color in the wintertime. So the brown weasel you see there, he's a summertime weasel. And as our days shorten, which is called photoperiod, the shortness of the days releases a hormone within the weasel, and it triggers the hair to change color. So in the winter, the short-tailed weasel is all white. You can see that there. They blend right in, except for this year. And then back in the springtime, they will turn brown again with that white belly. Now, a cool thing about weasels is that these guys, when they start to turn color, they don't turn color all at once or evenly. They end up looking all splotchy, and it's just funny to see them when they're halfway turned. Jackrabbits also turn color in the winter and in the summer. So if you happen to see a jackrabbit in the spring or the fall, they're kind of a splotchy mess of white and brown fur. The raccoon doesn't really fall into any category except for its own. They've made famous by their bandit masks and their striped tail, known on the Daniel Boone hats. Raccoons are omnivores, which means they eat everything. They eat plants, they eat animals, kind of whatever's handy. They tend to be a scavenger as well, and they're kind of given a bad rap for getting in people's garbage cans. They are kind of a really cool critter in that they have hands, and they grab their food. They tend to take it down to a water source and wash it off. It's not because they're clean, it's just that it helps them to digest the food. They also make noises, including they purr. People oftentimes think they want a raccoon as a pet. As babies, they're very cute, but they grow into big, kind of unpleasant animals. So they're not a good pet at all. And then you can find them across the state in just about all habitats. So in the trunk, we have a number of different bird species and bird species parts. Things to know about birds in North Dakota is that we have birds that live here all year round. We'll call those residential. And then we also have birds that are migratory, which means they just kind of come through. And so right about now, we've got snow geese that are coming through. We see them in the fall and the spring, and right now they're headed north, and they're gonna nest up in the Arctic. We have some birds that are native to North Dakota, which means throughout all time they've been here. And then we also have some introduced species for sportsmen and women for hunting. And so we're going to kind of talk about all those things, look at the artifacts that we have in the trunk for those. So first, let's take a look at owls. We have two examples of owls in our trunk. We have the snowy owl and the great horned owl. The snowy owl, if you're a Harry Potter fan, you know that the snowy owl is Harry Potter's pet. And so everybody knows about Harry Potter and the snowy owl. They have the best camouflage. They're white for camouflage, and they've got some brown specking on their wings. And so we see these guys in the wintertime. They're migratory, but they migrate to North Dakota in the winter. This is their Arizona, I guess you could say. They tend to eat small mammals and birds. And oftentimes if you're cruising around, you'll see them hanging out on the top of a fence post, or maybe even a little taller, looking for their next meal. Great horned owls live here year round. They're residential. They're known for their ears on top of their head. They're really not ears. They're just tufts of feathers. They're brown. They eat the same thing, small mammals and birds. You'll see them nesting both in residential areas and out on the prairie in the country. So because they are predators, they have some unique adaptations that allow them to be efficient at getting their next lunch. So when they fly in, they swoop in to capture whatever they're going to eat. They need to be quiet. And so I don't know if you can really see it in the picture, but the picture of the wing, the edges of the feathers are fringed. And so when they flap their wings, they're silent. And so they can swoop in and they can make that capture without alerting their prey that they're on their way in. And then of course they have those really strong talons that are sharp, and they can just grab that animal right away. When I visit schools, I hand these out to the kids, and they get to see actually how efficient that predator can be. It's really kind of an eye-opener. Waterfowl in North Dakota, waterfowl are everything from geese and ducks, mergansers, and there's a few other species, coots. In our trunk, we have examples of the Canada goose. And in North Dakota, we have both resident and migrant flocks. So we have some geese that stay here year round and some that go further south. We do know that they nest in North Dakota. And if you get out of your office at all, you'll know that the Canada geese are setting up house right now and are starting to nest and lay eggs. Snow goose are only migrant. We see them travel through on the way north and on the way south in the fall. They're white and they have a pink bill. And then mallards, we chose an example of our ducks. Mallards probably the most common, the most well known. The males have that big green head, and they're a larger duck. They're considered a dabbling duck, which means that if you see them on the pond, they just kind of tip upside down. Their butt goes up in the air and their head goes underwater, and that's how they feed. And we have mallards in the state, both as residents and as migrant flocks. And it is noted that if you're a licensed hunter, that all waterfowl are huntable. You can harvest them. Upland game species that we have in the trunk, these are native species, which means they have always been here. Sharp-tailed grouse and rough grouse. Sharpies or sharp-tailed grouse, I should say, are found on the prairie. They're famous for their dancing in the springtime. The males go to a flat area and they stomp their feet and they spread their wings, and they almost sound like a jackhammer. They're so loud. And they tend to gurgle, make a gurgling sound. They jump up and down. Where the female grouse will stand on the edge of the circle and just kind of take it all in, and that's how they select who they're going to mate with that year. Rough grouse, they also dance in the spring, but they tend to confine their antics to, they stand on a log and they do what's called drumming. And you can hear them from a long ways away, and it's a way for them to call in the females as well. Rough grouse are only found in woodlands, and they are limited to the Turtle Mountains, Pembina Gorge, and Killdeer Mountain areas. Both species can be hunted. I should note that right now the sharptail and the rough grouse are dancing. So if you have a desire for a field trip, I totally recommend you do that, and I can tell you where to go after we're done here. But there are areas in the Bismarck area, and then of course out west and other areas as well. So upland game birds that are exotic, they were introduced. And so turkey is one of the most hunted animals in North America. I just learned that. I've never gone turkey hunting, but apparently a lot of people do. They were introduced in North Dakota in the 60s when the Merriam's turkey was extirpated, and we talked about what that means. And they have grown, they become naturalized, they nest, and we don't release them anymore. And so the reason they do so well, farmyards, they do really well in farmyards, and then they disperse in the spring and the fall to have their young. And then in the wintertime, they tend to yard back up into those farmyards. The ringneck pheasant, once again, was introduced. I don't have a date on when that happened, but we know it's a big deal as far as hunting opportunities and bringing in money from non-resident hunters. And they've also naturalized. We're not releasing any more pheasants in the state anymore, and they've managed to do really well. Pheasants are found in prairie areas pretty much throughout the state now. So we do have some examples of reptiles, amphibians, and fish in the trunk. Well, let's talk about this group of animals. They're cold-blooded, which means that they don't have internal regulation of their temperature like mammals. They're found statewide, and a lot of, well, fish, for example, provide recreation opportunities. So if you're an angler, there's lots of places to catch fish in the state. So let's talk about reptiles. Prairie rattlesnake is the only venomous snake in North Dakota. They're found in the shortgrass prairie and the badlands in western North Dakota. They're not a big snake. They only get to be about 3 feet long. They can be a little longer, but all the snakes that I've seen, and I haven't seen a lot of them, but they're all about 3 feet. The great thing about the prairie rattlesnake is they're not terribly aggressive. I don't advise handling them, but they're not terribly aggressive. So they tend to rattle before strike, usually. And I always use that caveat because there's always going to be that one chance where somebody just got bit. But they're often confused with the bull snake, which is a snake that looks similar to the rattlesnake, but does not have rattles. They're also a lot bigger. Prairie rattlesnakes, can you die from a bite? Yeah. And so if you do get bit, I recommend you seek medical attention right away. Chances are you're going to be fine, but I do recommend medical attention. And if you're out and you have a dog that you have with you, I recommend you take it to the vet right away as well, because they can do some great things. Bull snakes, like I said, they look very much like a rattlesnake. Their head's a little different. Their coloration is very similar. They don't have rattles. Bull snakes get to be 6 feet. They're huge snakes. They'll bite you, but they're not poisonous or venomous. So you're not going to be, you might get a little infected. So wash out the wound. That's the worst thing that's going to happen to you. They do make this really cool hissing sound that sounds like a rattlesnake. And so if you're walking along and you didn't see the bull snake, it will startle you. And it does its job because most things will avoid that sound, including me. Amphibians in the trunk, We have an example of a leopard frog. It's in a jar, so you don't have to worry about it escaping into a classroom. In the jar, we have the adult stage of the leopard frog as well as the tadpole stage. The reason we chose the leopard frog is as it's the most common frog in North Dakota. Picture I have here is that it's green with black spots. They do come in kind of a light tan color as well. So both are the same species, just a little different color. And they do need to have an aquatic environment to complete their life cycle. But if you go for a walk in a park or near a lake or a river, chances are you're going to see a leopard frog. And so in the trunk, we also have examples of fish life stages. And so if you're teaching first grade or kindergarten, you're talking about the concept of metamorphosis. This is a really nice artifact to have. And so we've got the eyed eggs. So if you were to have that jar of eyed eggs, you can look and you can see there's little black dots on them. And those are the eyes. And that tells us that those eggs were alive before we preserved them. Then we have the next stage, which is called fry. They're called sac fry, where the egg is still there, but they've grown a spine and a tail, and they just live off the nutrients in the egg. And then finally they turn into what's called a smolt. And they just look like little fish, and they can actually eat things in the water. We have a lot of different species in the state, both native to the state and introduced. Most of the introduced species are there for recreation opportunity, but a lot of our native species are also recreationally based, and people come from all over the country to hunt, to fish for walleye and northern pike in North Dakota. So that's a great thing that we have here in the state, a wonderful resource. So let me talk about the trunk. You can check it out at our headquarters office in Bismarck, and also our game and fish offices statewide. And we have offices in Dickinson and Williston, Jamestown, and Devil's Lake. So all you have to do is make a phone call, and we can get that trunk to you if that's something you want to do. They're also found at the regional education cooperatives and teacher centers, and those are found in Minot, Mayville, Grand Forks, Fargo, Valley City, Williston, and Dickinson, and Bismarck. So there's opportunities throughout the state. The great thing is there's no charge. So I know there's a lot of great trunks and resources with all the agencies in the state. Some charge, some don't. We don't charge. Now, if this is something that you want to bring to your facility, but it's outside of your comfort level, give me a call. And if I can't come, I know a number of people within the agency, game and fish employees, maybe even you have a local parent or another employee that would be more interested because it's more in their wheelhouse. So a great resource to share and encourage awareness of our wildlife in North Dakota. And it does meet academic standards, and it's correlated to a lot of different content. And the kids love it, and adults find it very interesting. So if there are any questions, I will entertain them now. Otherwise, you can reach out to me at the address on the screen or the email. And so I just want to thank you for hosting me, and I'm just wondering if anybody has any questions.
Sherry, do those kids have to be picked up in person, or you guys mail them?
We do not mail them. Sometimes if we have somebody going to a community, we can kind of do a Pony Express thing, but
Okay.
But yeah.
Okay, thank you. Well, this was a great presentation full of some really interesting information. I did not know that moose were part of the deer family. So that was kind of eye-opening for me.
And I didn't know pronghorn were part of the distant relative of jackrabbit. That was interesting.
Right.
How do you pick, Sherry, what to introduce? like how, like you were saying, some are native to the land, some are introduced. Is that just based on like numbers?
So for example, for like the birds, the upland game birds. So that's kind of way above my pay grade, but but what happens is the biologists look for recreation opportunities and where there are holes in recreation opportunities. For example, in North Dakota, we have the native grouse, and then that's it. So they wanted additional species for hunters to be able to harvest. And so that's how they went to the pheasant. And then we did have turkey in the state for many years. And then, of course, they were extirpated by hunters before we had any hunting regulations. And so we realized that turkey would be a good fit in the state again. And so that's why they were reintroduced. Good question.
Are there other things that are a one and done tag? I mean, you mentioned a couple of them.
So the one and done tags, they're called the lifetime tag, elk and moose and bighorn.
Okay.
But otherwise, the other animals that have tags you can apply every year. And depending on the availability of tags, how many animals we have on the landscape, they set the numbers, and then you may or may not receive a tag. It just kind of depends on how our statisticians work the numbers and the number of licenses that are available.
And Sherry, how do you see the drought impacting some of the populations you talked about today?
So first of all, the rain this weekend was wonderful, but you know, we need more rain. And so the drought right now is not a big deal yet. I mean, I know it's a big deal for agriculture, but from a wildlife perspective, it's not a big deal yet. But pheasants, partridge, we have great partridge in the state, and the grouse species, when those chicks are born, and turkeys for that matter, when those chicks are born, they don't eat seeds. They eat a lot of insects because they have a high protein count. And so with the lack of moisture, we're probably not going to have a lot of bugs. And so that will impact the survivability of those chicks.
Sure.
Yeah. As far as waterfowl, they'll probably be okay because those mama ducks, if they nest in a field, they can march those ducklings over a mile to a wetland to get food. So that's kind of amazing, but they're very well adapted to finding food on the prairie.
Interesting. Any other questions?
Sherry, how long are those trunks available? Is it just by need, or by how many people want it at the time, the availability?
We operate on a first come, first served basis. We have several at the department headquarters, so there's usually a trunk available. Right now is kind of a hot time for trunks. It's the end of the year and teachers are doing all the fun stuff. But you know, it's first come, first serve. I always tell people plan ahead. And so, you know, if you're going to need it for, you know, October 4th, let me know at the end of September and we'll make sure that it happens. We'll put your name on it. You can keep them for about 2 weeks. That's kind of our recommended limit. And then just get them back to us for the next person. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Sherry, thanks for telling us about this great resource. Some of us, well, I know I wasn't familiar with it, and there was just a lot of really great information shared just in general about, you know, all the different species that you taught us about. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.